The night smelled like iron and wolf. Tuva Christensen had learned to read rooms the way animals read storms, by the pressure in the air before anything visible happened. And the Grand Conclave's great hall of Greyspire keep was humming with something wrong tonight, something coiled and vibrating beneath the laughter and the torchlight and the clash of mead cups. 100 alpha lords from every corner of Valdrak assembled to press their king on a single, immovable subject, the matter of a mate. She moved between them like smoke. Gray dress, bare feet, iron collar cold against the hollow of her throat. She had learned to make herself forgettable, to trim herself down to function and nothing else. A refilled goblet, a cleared platter, a shadow that moved without casting itself on anything important. 23 years of this. 23 years of keeping her eyes on the floor and her breath quiet and her wants so deeply buried she could barely remember she'd ever had them. She was reaching across Lord Brynjolf's enormous shoulder to refill his wine when she felt it. A gaze. Not the casual, dismissive sweep of men who saw her as furniture. Not the cruelty of lords who noticed her only to remind themselves of her station. This was something else, something deliberate, specific, and heavy as a hand pressed flat against her spine. It moved through her like cold water through river stone. She should not have looked up. Every instinct she possessed, every lesson carved into her by 23 years of survival, screamed at her to keep her eyes down, to finish the pour, to disappear back into the gray. She looked up. At the high table, draped in the shadow of iron torchlight, King Jonas Faragen had gone very, very still. His dark eyes were fixed on her with an expression she had never seen on a man's face before. Not hunger, not contempt, not the casual cruelty she had grown so expert at surviving. Something else. Something that looked almost like recognition. Like a man who had just seen something he had stopped believing existed. The hall roared around them. No one else noticed. Tuva looked away first. Her hands had not shaken in years. They were shaking now. Quick pause. Comment where you're watching from, and if you're enjoying this story, please like and subscribe. I've got a lot more coming. Chapter 1. The Collar and the Crown. 3 days before the conclave, the kitchens of Greyspire keep smelled like boiled turnips and wet wool, and Tuva Christensen was on her knees on the stone floor scrubbing a pot that hadn't been properly cleaned in a week. This was her life. This was the whole of it. She had a system. That was how she survived. Everything had a system, a rhythm, a sequence that kept her moving forward without ever having to look up long enough to feel the weight of what her life actually was. Kitchens before dawn. Linens before breakfast. The east corridor before the lords woke, while the torches were still guttering, and the only sound was her bare feet on cold stone. She knew every crack in every floor of Greyspire's servants' quarters. She knew which steps creaked, and which door hinges shrieked, and which passages a woman could move through without being seen. Invisibility was not a gift. It was a craft. And Tuva had mastered it the way a soldier mastered a blade, not from talent, but from necessity, from the years of understanding that being noticed rarely ended in anything good. The iron collar had been on her throat since she was 7 years old. She barely felt its weight anymore, the way you stopped hearing a sound that never stopped. It was not decoration. Every servant bound into the Faragen household wore one. The iron suppressed the wolf, the keep steward had explained once, years ago, when she had asked with the terrible frankness of a child. It keeps you stable. It keeps you safe. It keeps you from being something you were never meant to be. She had believed him for a long time. She had believed most things they told her, because they told her nothing else. The truth she had assembled herself, in pieces, over years. The collar suppressed the wolf not for safety, but for control. A servant who could shift was a servant who had power. A servant with power was not a servant at all. The collar was not protection. It was a cage worn at the throat, polished to look like iron lace. But understanding the cage doesn't break it. And Tuva was 23 years old, and she had been bound into service at this court before she had any memory of her parents, of whatever disgraced life her family had led before the Faragen lords stripped them of pack status and delivered her here like a debt payment made in flesh. She finished the pot, stood, rolled her shoulders back to release the ache of the stone floor. Through the narrow window above the washing basin, she could see the first carts of the conclave arriving in the courtyard below. Lords and their retinues, their mounted wolves trotting alongside carriages, breath steaming in the cold morning air. They came from the north and the south, from the border territories and the deep forest packs, 100 men who controlled Valdrak's territories and answered, nominally, to one king. She had heard the whispers about the conclave for weeks. The servants always heard first. The lords were coming to press Jonas Varangian on the matter of a mate. 11 years since his coronation. No queen.
No heir.
The kingdom's succession was a wound the nobility picked at constantly, and this conclave had been positioned, she gathered, as an ultimatum dressed in ceremony. Tuva knew almost nothing about the king in any personal sense. That was the way of it when you were nobody. The king was an idea more than a man, a distant, enormous, dangerous idea that moved through the keep like weather. You moved around him. You didn't look at him. You kept your head down and your presence slight, and you thanked whatever gods existed for the days when he was in council chambers and the corridors were clear. She knew what he looked like, in the way you knew any powerful thing, not through examination, but through the shapes they left in the world. He was tall. He was scarred. He had been crowned at 22 after his father's murder, and he had spent the 12 years since consolidating, fighting, purging weakness from the kingdom's borders with a ruthlessness that had made Valdrak safer and the king himself a figure no one in their right mind looked at directly. She'd heard it said, once low and careful, between two senior house servants, the king has no mate bond. He never will. The moon goddess passed him over. Some men are meant to be alone. The woman who said it had not sounded sad about it. She had sounded almost relieved. Tuva had thought about it briefly, turned it over, decided it was not her concern. She had her own weight to carry. She dried the pot, moved to the next task. In the far wing of Greyspire, behind 3 layers of oak door and a hallway of guards whose loyalty had been tested and retested until it was iron hard, Jonas Varangian stood at the window of his private study and listened to his chief advisor Einar Hogseth tell him things he did not want to hear. The Western lords are unified on this, Einar said. He was a lean, silver-haired man with the bearing of someone who had delivered bad news to dangerous people so many times it had become its own kind of armor. Vakovan has spent 6 months building consensus. The conclave will pass a formal resolution. I know what it will pass. And if you dismiss it without response, the law of succession gives them grounds too. I know what the law says.
Einar Post
folded his hands. The fire in the grate popped. Jonas turned from the window. He was 34 years old and built like the consequence of war, broad through the shoulder, dark-eyed, the crown a plain iron thing that sat on his head with the air of something functional rather than ceremonial. The scars along his jaw and left forearm were old. His hands were not. Tell me what Vakovan actually wants, Jonas said. He wants Astrid on the throne. Astrid is 20 years old and afraid of horses. She is Lord Vakovan's daughter and a purebred alpha line, and she has been groomed for this since she was 12. What she is afraid of is irrelevant to what she represents. Jonas was quiet for a moment. Outside, in the courtyard below, the first conclave guests were arriving. He watched them without expression. A mate bond is not a political arrangement, he said finally. It cannot be assigned.
No.
But in the absence of a true bond, which, as you've indicated, appears unlikely, Jonas repeated. There was something in his voice that Einar had the sense to step carefully around. A political contract can achieve similar ends. The bloodline continues. The succession is secured. The lords are satisfied. Silence. Leave, Jonas said. Einar left. Jonas stood alone at the window for a long time. The courtyard filled with wolves. He watched them with the expression of a man who had learned to want nothing because wanting was just another form of weakness, and weakness, in his experience, was always punished. He turned back to the empty room. In the kitchen 3 floors below, Tuva Christensen started on the next pot. Her hands had stopped shaking. They hadn't had reason to shake in years. She did not think about the king. She did not think about much at all. That was the system. She kept moving. Chapter 2. The Weight of a Gaze. The Grand Conclave was a performance, like most things involving 100 men who believed their importance was the most important fact about themselves. Tuva understood this without bitterness. She was good at understanding things without bitterness, Bitterness was a luxury that cost more than it returned. She understood that the conclave's 3-day structure was theater. The first day for arrivals and meals, and the careful staging of who sat near whom. The second day for formal declarations and the political chess of seating arrangements and who received invitations to private councils. The third day for whatever the first 2 days had been building toward. She understood all of this the way she understood the architecture of Greyspire Keep. Not because anyone had explained it to her, but because she had spent 23 years moving through spaces where powerful men thought no one was listening, and powerful men, when they thought no one was listening, said everything. She had been assigned to the high table on the second day. This was not a reward. The high table was where the senior lord sat, where the king sat, and it was the most dangerous assignment in the hall. The proximity was tighter. The expectations were higher. The men who ate there were more powerful, and therefore more likely to notice if a servant was anything less than completely invisible, and noticing was rarely good. Tuva arrived early to prepare the place settings, moving in the gray hour before the lords descended from their chambers, when the hall still belonged to the servants, and the light came in low and golden through the high windows. She set goblets with the precise efficiency of someone who had done it 1,000 times. She checked that the platters were positioned correctly, that the linens were smooth, that nothing about the arrangement would draw comment. She did not look at the king's chair. She was good at not looking at things. The lords arrived in waves. She moved, refilled,
Cleared.
kept her eyes at table level, where hands and goblets lived, where the world was manageable and comprehensible. Lord Brynjolf arrived, loud and meaty and smelling like he'd been drinking since morning. He occupied the seat 3 down from the king's with the proprietary ease of a man who had never been told to take up less space. Lord Valkoven arrived last among the senior table. He was a tall man, silver-haired and angular, with a kind of precise, controlled stillness that Tuva recognized as more dangerous than noise. He had a young woman with him, his daughter Astrid, who was pale and pretty and sat with the practiced posture of someone who had been trained to perform serenity. Tuva glanced at her once, and looked away. The girl's eyes were fixed on the king's empty chair with an expression that mixed hope with resignation in a way Tuva understood more than she wanted to. She was still moving between the lower tables when the hall went quiet. Not completely quiet, just quieter. The shift in volume that happened when a room's most powerful occupant entered it. She did not look up. She heard him move to the high table. Heard the lords rise briefly in acknowledgement. Heard Einar Hogsetha's voice making introductions. She kept her back to the high end of the hall and refilled a goblet for a minor lord whose name she didn't know, and she breathed carefully, and she did not look. The first night passed without incident. Tuva ate standing in the kitchen passage, 3 bites of bread and cold pork, before returning to the hall for the second course. By midnight, when the last lords had drained the last cups and the servants were moving through the wreckage of the feast with clean linens and weary arms, she had almost convinced herself that this assignment was manageable after all. The second day was harder. She was tired. That was the beginning of it. She had slept 4 hours, maybe less, wedged into the narrow bunk she shared with 2 other servants in the lower quarters, and tired meant the edges of her system frayed slightly. The careful management of attention and posture that kept her invisible required maintenance, and maintenance required rest, and rest was a thing she received in small, insufficient doses. By the second evening, the hall was louder, drunker, more restless. The political negotiations were thickening the air like smoke. Lord Valkoven had been in private council with 3 other territorial lords for 2 hours. Lord Brynjolf had already made 2 comments about the king's succession that bordered on insubordinate, laughed too loud, and been ignored. Tuva was carrying a heavy platter of roasted boar down the length of the hall when the ache behind her sternum began. It was not pain exactly, more like pressure, like the feeling before a storm, when the air thickens and the body reads the change before the mind processes it. She slowed, fractionally, set the platter down, pressed one hand briefly to her ribs, where the feeling centered. The iron collar was warm. That was strange. The collar was always cold. It was iron. It never warmed. She stood very still for one full breath and told herself it was fatigue. Told herself she was reading the room's tension into her own body. Told herself to pick up the platter and keep moving. She picked up the platter, kept moving. She was 2 steps from the high table when she felt the gaze again. More specific than the night before. More deliberate. She felt it locate her with a precision that was almost physical, like a finger pressing gently against the back of her neck. Keep moving.
Eyes down.
You are furniture. She set the platter. Began to clear space for it. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency and she was doing fine. She was invisible. She looked up. He was watching her. Not the sweeping, dismissive look of a man surveying the servants. Not even the sharp, evaluating look of a man noticing a problem. This was, she could not name it. She had spent 23 years learning to read the faces of powerful men for danger, and this expression was not in her catalog. He was watching her with a focused, slightly stunned attention of a man who had just heard a sound he couldn't identify. Like something in her had activated something in him that he hadn't known was dormant. Their eyes met for less than 2 seconds. Tuva looked away. Her pulse was loud in her own ears. She completed the clearing of the platter with hands that were not shaking, she would not let them shake, and moved back down the hall and through the passage door and leaned against the kitchen wall in the dark and pressed her fist against her sternum, where the pressure still lived. The collar was warm. Still warm. She stood there for a long moment, breathed, assembled herself. Nothing happened. She had looked up. The king had looked at her. That was all. Men looked at servants. It meant nothing. She would go back into the hall, and she would keep moving, and by tomorrow the conclave would be done, and she would be back in the lower quarters where the world was small and comprehensible and survivable. She went back into the hall. He was still watching when she returned to the high table. She felt it without looking, felt it the way you feel a heat source without turning toward it. She kept her eyes at goblet level. She kept her breathing even. She kept moving. But the pressure in her chest did not ease. And the collar, against all reason, stayed warm for the rest of the night. She did not sleep. She lay in her narrow bunk in the dark and told herself she had imagined it. She told herself this so many times that by morning she almost believed it. Almost. Chapter 3. You have no mate. The third night of the conclave was when everything broke open. It began in the East Corridor, where it always began in Tuva's life. In the margins, in the spaces between the important rooms, in the gaps where a woman who was nobody moved between the places where nobody things were done. She was carrying a stack of linens from the upstairs chambers back toward the laundry when Lord Brynjolf found her. She had been found before.
This was not the first time.
It was the particular ugliness of being a woman who was nobody in a castle full of men who were somebodies that the corridors between the important places became dangerous geography, and that danger had no recourse because nobody things didn't have rights that somebody men were obligated to respect. She had survived previous encounters by being small, by going still, by offering no resistance that might escalate, by finding the fastest path to the end of the moment and moving through it. She tried that now, pressed herself against the wall, made herself small, said nothing. Brynjolf was drunk, not stupidly drunk, but the specific kind of drunk that made a man feel unchecked, that took the ordinary rudeness he might have expressed in smaller forms and expanded it into something physical. He had his wife's ring on his hand. He had never once appeared to find this relevant. Omega, he said, the way he always said it, like a word that meant worthless, like a word that was its own argument. His hand closed around her arm. She kept her face still and her breathing even and waited for the end of the moment. The hand on her arm yanked. The linens hit the floor. She made one sound, one involuntary sound, low and bitten back, and something happened. The door at the end of the corridor opened. She knew without looking who it was. She knew from the quality of the silence that preceded the footsteps. She knew from the way Brynjolf went very still beside her and released her arm with the abruptness of a man who had been caught by something with teeth. Jonas Farragon moved down the corridor like weather. He did not run. He did not raise his voice. He simply walked with a controlled, deliberate pace that was somehow more terrifying than speed, and when he stopped, he was between Tuva and Brynjolf, and his hand was around the Lord's throat with a grip that had closed before anyone in the corridor had fully processed he'd moved. Brynjolf's face went red. His hands came up in the automatic response of a man whose air had just been restricted. "My king," he started. "Don't." One word. Quiet. Absolute. There were other people in the corridor now. Jonas's guards. Einar, somewhere behind them, with the expression of a man calculating the political cost of what he was watching in real time. Brynjolf dangled slightly, not lifted from his feet but crowded against the wall, the king's grip not tight enough to choke, but tight enough to communicate everything that needed communicating. Jonas held him there for 5 seconds.
7.
Long enough for the lesson to have no ambiguity. Then he released him. Straightened. Turned. He did not look at Brynjolf again. He looked at Tuva.
Come, he said.
Not gently. Not unkindly. Just directly. The way he might direct a guard or a steward. The way a man spoke who was accustomed to being obeyed without the soft coating of request. She came. She didn't know what else to do. He led her through a set of doors she had never been through, into a room that was clearly a private study. Books, maps, a fire burning low. 2 chairs positioned at angles that suggested the room was used for thought rather than performance. No one else entered with them. She heard the door close. Tuva stood with her back to the door, and her hands clasped in front of her, and her eyes somewhere between the floor and the middle distance, in the position she had perfected for being in rooms where she was not supposed to be. The silence stretched. Look at me, he said. She looked at him. He was across the room, standing in front of the fire. The firelight moved across the planes of his face, the jaw, the cheekbones, the scar that ran along the left side of his chin. He was watching her with that expression again. The one she didn't have a catalog entry for. Focused. Slightly stunned. Like a man who had seen something impossible and was still deciding whether it was real. How long have you been at this court? He asked. She blinked. It was not what she had expected. Since I was 7, my king. Something moved across his face. Too fast to read. Your family. Disgraced. My king. Their pack bond was revoked before my memory. I was bonded into household service as she stopped. As partial settlement. He was quiet for a moment. She could hear the fire. She could hear her own pulse. The bond suppressor, he said. He was looking at her collar. Has anyone assessed you? For wolf status. The court assesses all Omega-class servants at 14. I was assessed as wolfless. Were you? It was not a question. It was the tone of a man who had just received information that didn't match something he already knew. She kept her face still. That is what the assessment determined. Another silence. He took 1 step toward her, and then stopped. His jaw was tight. He looked, she thought, like a man fighting something. Like a man who was accustomed to winning every fight he entered, and had just encountered one that was, for reasons he couldn't fully articulate, refusing to be won. When did it start? He asked quietly. She didn't ask what he meant. She knew what he meant. She had known since the second night of the conclave, when the pressure behind her sternum had refused to be reasoned away. She had known, and she had tried very hard to bury the knowing under enough layers of practical thought that it would stop being true.
The second evening, she said.
Of the conclave. He breathed out through his nose. Closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, there was something in his face she could not name. Not anger, not relief. Something rawer than either. He crossed the room. Stopped 2 feet from her. Close enough that she could see the texture of the scar on his jaw, the specific dark of his eyes in the low firelight. The collar at her throat pulsed warmth. You have no mate, he said. She understood what it was. It was not a question. It was not even an accusation. It was a command, directed at reality itself, at the universe, at whatever ancient mechanism had decided, with terrible timing and no apparent regard for political consequences, to activate a bond between the Alpha King of Valdrak and a servant girl in a gray dress. It was a king ordering things to be different, ordering the world to correct itself. She looked at him.
His jaw.
The crown that sat on his head like iron meant for war. The expression that had no place in her catalog. She thought about lying. She was very good at making herself small, at trimming herself to what a room needed her to be. She could say, yes, my king, you are right, there is nothing, I felt nothing, I apologize for the confusion. She could offer him the escape hatch and watch him take it and go back to her narrow bunk and her system and the gray life that was, at least, survivable. She thought about it for a full second. Then she said, very quietly, I didn't before. I think. I do now. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. He stared at her, and she saw, for just a moment, just one moment, before his expression locked down into something more controlled. She saw relief. Pure, terrible, unwilling relief. The expression of a man who had been told the thing he had stopped believing in still existed, and had no idea yet whether to call that good news or a catastrophe. She was not sure herself. Outside the study door, she heard footsteps. Einar's voice, low and urgent. The world that had been briefly suspended by the closed door was about to reassert itself. Jonas Farragon looked at her for one more long moment. Then he turned toward the door. "Stay here," he said. She stayed. Chapter 4. The King's Mistake. In the years that followed, the political historians of Valdrak would cite that night, the third night of the Grand Conclave, as the moment Jonas Farragon made the first strategic error of his reign. They were not wrong that it was a mistake.
They were wrong about why.
The mistake was not acknowledging the bond. The mistake was not dismissing the conclave early. The mistake was not the order that removed Tuva from the servant quarters and placed her under direct royal protection, or the guards posted at the door of the small, decent room in the south wing where she now sat, bewildered and quiet, in a chair that was softer than anything she had sat in before. The mistake, the real mistake, the one that Jonas would understand later in the long, grinding months to come, was that he acted before he had decided. He had spent 12 years making decisions on strategy, on calculation, on the patient assembly of long-term outcomes. He had never once in those years acted on instinct alone. He acted on instinct on the third night of the conclave, and instinct, in a kingdom full of men who monitored the king for weakness, was indistinguishable from vulnerability. The conclave lords left the following morning. They left furious. Lord Vakoven departed last, his face a careful mask of political neutrality that fooled no one who knew him. He paused at the gate and looked back at the keep with an expression that Einar, watching from the courtyard wall, described to Jonas later as a man who had just decided the game had changed. "He'll move," Einar said. "Yes." Quickly. His daughter was positioned for a reason, and if word reaches the other territorial lords before we control the narrative. What narrative would you suggest?
Einar Post.
He had the look of a man who had many suggestions and was, for once, uncertain which of them was survivable. The official position, when asked, should be that the servant girl is under protection pending investigation into the incident with Lord Brynjolf. That gives us...
No.
Jonas. I said no. Another pause. Einar pressed his lips together. He had served 2 kings, and he had delivered bad news to both of them, and he had survived both experiences precisely because he knew when to push and when to fold. Then what is the official position? Jonas was quiet for a moment. I don't have one yet. Give me 2 days. He did not have 2 days. He had approximately 8 hours before the rumors reached critical mass and began feeding themselves. The keep servants, who heard everything, who said nothing while being heard saying everything, who formed the most efficient information network in the kingdom, had already carried the broad strokes to every corridor by dawn. By midday, it was in the outer city. By evening, a version of it had reached the border lord's fastest messengers. The Alpha King had felt a bond with a servant. An Omega, a collared nobody from a disgraced family. The heir of Valdrak was going to mate with a piece of furniture. That was the kindest version. Jonas heard the variations. He heard them through Einar, through his guard, Captain Rolf, through the particular quality of silence that fell in rooms when he entered them, which was different now from the silence that had preceded him before, still fear, but mixed with something else. Uncertainty. Reassessment. He went to Tuva on the second afternoon. She was in the south wing room, sitting in the chair, and she had clearly not moved much because the room looked exactly as it had when she'd arrived. Neat, careful, nothing touched or disturbed. She stood when he entered reflex, the automatic posture of a servant. He watched her do it, and something in his chest turned over. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He remained standing. He moved to the window, looked out at the practice yard below, where the castle guard was running drills with the focused energy of men who had been given extra training time because the alternative was standing still and thinking about the tension that had gripped the keep. "They'll begin formally," he said without turning. "Vakoven will invoke old law. He'll argue the mate claim is politically unfit and request a council hearing. That will take. My king." Her voice was quiet, but it was not small. There was something in it he had noticed on the third night, a steadiness that didn't match the way she held herself, like something in her that refused to entirely disappear no matter how much pressure was applied to it. "What do you want from me?"
He turned.
She was looking at him, directly, which was new. In the corridor and the study, she had found ways to look mostly at him, at his general direction, at a point slightly adjacent to his face. Now she was just looking at him, dark eyes level and patient and slightly wary, the way you looked at a complicated problem you had decided to face without flinching. "I mean," she continued carefully, "you removed me from the servant quarters. You have guards on my door. That changes my situation in ways that I don't know what the ways are. I don't know what is expected of me now. I don't know what you intend."
She paused.
"I think I should know." She was right. He recognized that immediately. It was the same kind of precision he valued in military briefings, the person who asked the specific question no one else wanted to ask because it required admitting they didn't already know the answer. The problem was that he did not, in fact, know what he intended. He had spent 12 years knowing what he intended. He woke each morning with a full architecture of intent. The day's decisions nested inside the week's strategy, nested inside the year's long-term positioning. He had governed a kingdom with borders under constant pressure and a nobility that smelled weakness the way wolves smelled blood, and he had done it by being so relentlessly clear on his intentions that the other men in the room never had time to manufacture alternatives. He did not know what he intended with this. He knew what he felt. He knew the pull of the bond, had felt it intensifying in the days since the conclave, a presence at the edge of his awareness like a fire in his peripheral vision, warm and specific and refusing to be ignored. He knew that when she'd spoken in the study, "I didn't before. I think I do now," something in him had locked into place with the terrible, relieved finality of a door finding its frame. But knowing what he felt and knowing what he intended were different things. One was a fact of his body. The other was a choice he hadn't made yet. "I don't know," he said. She blinked. He wondered if a king had ever told her he didn't know something. He wondered if anyone had. "I moved you because I needed time to think," he continued. "I dismissed the conclave because I needed the room clear to think. I'm aware that neither of those decisions was strategically optimal." He looked at her. "I'm working on it." A silence. And then, very carefully, she said, "I can go back."
No.
It would simplify.
No.
The word came out with more force than he intended. He registered her slight stillness. Adjusted. "No," he said again, quieter. "That's not," he stopped.
Pressed his jaw together.
"That is not the solution I'm building toward." She was quiet. He watched her absorb this and file it with the careful efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime processing information they weren't fully permitted to have. "What solution are you building toward?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon light came through the window and fell across her face, and he could see, now that he was actually looking, the things the gray dress and the iron collar and the years of carefully cultivated smallness had been covering. The line of her jaw, the particular steadiness in her eyes that had nothing to do with submission and everything to do with the survival intelligence that had been running below the surface all along. "I don't know yet," he said again. She nodded, as if that were a reasonable answer, as if she had enough experience with uncertainty to know that sometimes it was the only honest one. He left. He spent the rest of the day in the council chamber, working through the legal and political architecture of what was coming with Einar and his senior advisors. It was complicated. It was going to get worse. Vakovan had 3 decades of political positioning and a coalition of lords who believed in blood purity with the fervor of men who benefited from the hierarchy it maintained. But Jonas had governed this kingdom for 12 years on the simple principle that the only way out of complicated was through it. He would find the way through. What he could not yet admit to himself, what he would understand only later, looking back, was that the complication he was most afraid of had nothing to do with Vakovan. It was the look on her face when she'd said, "I can go back." The readiness in it. The practiced, terrible willingness to make herself small again. That, more than any political threat, was what he was most determined to prevent.
Chapter 5.
The wolf she was never allowed to be. They came on the 7th night, in the hour before dawn when the keep was darkest, and the watch was thinnest, and the corridors between the south wing and the outer gates formed a geography that someone had spent time learning. Tuva heard them before she saw them. She had always been good at hearing things, had developed it the same way she developed all her survival skills, through years of necessity that had no vocabulary for choice. She heard the particular quality of silence that followed the guard at her door going still and not moving again, and she was off the bed and against the far wall before her mind had fully articulated the threat. 3 of them came through the door. They were not wearing house colors. That was the first thing she registered. No allegiance markings, nothing that could be traced. Professional hired absence. Men whose purpose was to leave no traceable thread. The second thing she registered was that they were wolves. She could feel it in the air of the room, that particular electric density of a shifted presence, held in, coiled, ready. The third thing she registered was that there was no way out of the room except through them. She had been in bad situations before. She knew the calculus of bad situations, how to assess them, how to find the path through that did the least damage, how to survive. Her eyes moved to the window. 2nd floor. Drop would hurt but not break. She would need. The first one reached for her. And something happened. It started low in her chest, where the bond's warmth lived, where the collar's heat had been building since the conclave, since the study, since the days of proximity to a man whose presence hummed against her awareness like a frequency she couldn't stop receiving. The warmth expanded, became heat, became something that was not heat exactly but pressure, enormous and internal, like water behind a dam that had been holding for 23 years and had, abruptly, had enough. The iron collar at her throat went from warm to scalding. She heard herself make a sound she had never made before. The first man's hand was still reaching for her. She grabbed his wrist, and that was all she did, just grabbed his wrist. And the next thing she knew, she was on the floor, and he was across the room, and the room smelled like singed metal and electricity and something old and wild that she had no name for. The second man stopped moving. The third man stepped back. Tuva looked at her hands. They were different. Not shifted, not pause, not the full wolf she had never been allowed to become. Something in between. Something at the threshold. The biology of it straining against 23 years of suppression, pushing through the iron's cage with the desperate force of anything that has been held down too long. Her fingers were longer. Her nails were not nails. Not quite claws. The collar at her throat was burning. She looked up. The 3 men were staring at her with expressions she had never seen directed at herself. Not contempt, not dismissal, not the specific weaponized indifference of men who saw her as nobody. They were afraid. She heard the door behind them shatter. Jonas came through it like consequence. He was not in armor. He was in the clothes of a man who had been awake in the small hours, who had heard something through a bond that did not require proximity to transmit certain frequencies of distress. There was blood on his shoulder, a gash, already closing, from something that had happened in the outer corridor. He moved through the door with the controlled violence of a man whose body had a great deal of experience with rooms full of enemies and very little patience for them. The 2 standing men had roughly 3 seconds to make a decision. They made the wrong one. It was not long. Jonas was precise when he fought. Not brutal, or not only brutal, but efficient, the way a man is efficient who has spent 12 years in the business of keeping himself alive. When it was over, 2 of them were down and the third had retreated through the window, the drop to the courtyard below that Tuva had been calculating, and the room smelled like adrenaline and cold air and that old wild thing that Tuva could not name. Jonas turned. He was breathing harder than usual. The shoulder wound was bleeding through his shirt. He stood in the middle of the room and looked at her with the expression of a man who had just arrived to prevent a disaster and was trying to assess whether he'd managed it in time. His eyes traveled from her face to her hands, to the threshold state of her fingers, the partial emergence that the collar hadn't been able to fully prevent, to the collar itself, which had left a faint burn ring on her skin where the iron had seared against the heat of something trying to break free.
"What are you?" he said.
Quiet. Not afraid. He did not appear to do afraid. But something very close to awe, which she had not expected from a man who regarded the world with iron certainty. She looked down at her hands. They were returning to normal. She could feel the withdrawal of whatever had surged up, the tide pulling back now that the immediate threat had passed, retreating to the deep where 23 years of suppression had sent it. The collar cooled. "I don't know," she said. Her voice was steadier than she had any right to expect. "You have a wolf," the assessment said. The assessment was wrong. He said it with the absolute finality of a man who had just watched evidence override all prior documentation. He crossed the room in 3 steps. He reached out and touched the collar. Not roughly. His fingers were careful, almost tentative, which was a quality she had not associated with him and which shocked her more than the violence had. He examined the burn mark on her skin.
His jaw tightened.
This has been suppressing more than the collar is designed to suppress, he said. Something significant.
I assumed I didn't have, she stopped.
She had assumed. She had been told, and she had assumed, and she had built a life around the assumption. I've never shifted. You almost shifted tonight. He looked at her. The firelight had died to coals, and the room was gray and pre-dawn, and in that light, he looked less like the Iron King, and more like a man who was learning something that was changing the shape of things he had thought he understood. Whatever you are, it has been caged by that collar since you were 7 years old. She absorbed this. She turned it over. She felt the weight of it, the specific, terrible weight of 23 years of someone else's cage, and she did not let it take her. Not yet. There would be time for that later. There would need to be time for that later, in private, where the feeling could be what it was without an audience.
Are you hurt? He asked.
She almost said no reflexively, the automatic minimizing answer, the furniture answer. She stopped herself.
Checked.
Her wrist ached where the first man had grabbed it. The collar burn stung. She was shaking slightly, adrenaline still running.
A little, she said.
You. He glanced at his shoulder with a mild expression of a man who had categorized the wound as minor and moved on. I'll manage. You need to have that looked at. Later. It's bleeding. Later. But something in his face shifted, a fractional softening, the kind that was probably invisible to people who hadn't spent years learning to read the micro-expressions of powerful men. Like he had noted that she had worried about him and didn't know what to do with that, and had filed it somewhere to think about when he had more room. He stepped back, looked around the room, the 2 men on the floor, the broken door, the chaos of an assassination attempt that had not succeeded. His expression was shifting back toward strategy now, toward the calculating architecture of a man assembling responses. I'll double the guard, he said. Move you to chambers closer to the Jonas. He stopped. She had never said his name. She had not intended to say his name. It came out of its own volition, cutting through the strategic assessment with something that required an answer more immediate than guard rotations. He looked at her. I'm not nothing, she said. She said it quietly. She said it the way you say a thing you are still in the process of deciding whether to believe, with the particular fragility of a conviction that is newly assembled and not yet fully certain of its own weight. But she said it. She held his gaze, and she said it. Jonas Farragon looked at her for a long moment. The gray pre-dawn light, the burned collar, the hands that had, against 23 years of iron certainty, refused to be only hands. No, he agreed quietly. You're not. Outside the keep, the first bird of morning began to sing. Inside the ruined room, something shifted between them. Not the bond, which was already a constant, already a frequency she had stopped trying to tune out. Something else. The particular shift of 2 people who have faced a violent thing together and come through it, and now have to reckon with the fact that they came through it together. She was not nothing. She had never been nothing. She was just beginning to be able to say it out loud. Chapter 6. What the Old Blood Remembers. Keeper Astrid Halvorsen arrived on a Tuesday, in the rain, without invitation. She was not the king's advisor Astrid. Vakoven's daughter had departed with her father after the conclave and had not returned. This Astrid was older by 4 decades, narrow as a winter branch, with white hair coiled tight against her head and the particular quality of stillness that Tuva associated with people who had spent a lifetime thinking and had developed, as a result, a relationship with quiet that other people found unsettling. She was the court's eldest lorekeeper. She had, Tuva gathered from the careful way Jonas and Einar spoke about her arrival, not left the archive tower in 11 years. She had walked down 4 flights of stairs and across 3 courtyards in the rain, which suggested she had a reason she considered worth the effort. She looked at Tuva for a long, unblinking moment when they were introduced. Then she said, "Show me your hands." Tuva showed her hands. The keeper examined them with the clinical attention of a physician checking a specific thing she was looking for. She turned them over. She looked at the burn marks the collar had left on Tuva's throat. She stepped back. As I thought, she said, to no one in particular. What did you think?
Jonas said.
I'll need the archive. There's a specific text. She was already moving toward the door. I'll send for her when I've found it. She sent for Tuva 3 hours later. The archive tower smelled like dust and time and the particular pungency of very old parchment. Keeper Halvorsen was at a reading table with a text spread before her, open to a page that was illustrated in old ink, a wolf in profile, silver-tinted, with markings along its flanks that Tuva recognized, with a shock that moved through her like cold water from the brief, partial emergence of her own. She sat down across from the keeper, looked at the illustration. Her pulse was very loud. The Stormwalker bloodline, Halvorsen said, without preamble. She had the tone of someone who considered softening information a kind of dishonesty. You know the name?
No.
They ensured you wouldn't. The keeper turned the text to face her. 200 years ago, the Stormwalker wolves were the most significant pack line in northern Valdrak. Not the most powerful in the conventional sense, not the largest territory or the strongest fighters. But their gift was something more difficult to oppose than strength. She tapped the illustration. They could silence another wolf.
Completely.
At will, through a held gaze, the Stormwalker could suspend the animal in any other shifter, stop it mid-surge, pull it back from a shift, arrest a dominant alpha in full aggression. It was not violence. It was not even unpleasant, reportedly. It simply stopped, like a hand placed gently over a flame. Tuva looked at the page, at the silver markings on the illustrated wolf's flanks, at the way the artist had rendered the eyes, not wild, not feral, but deeply, specifically still. What happened to them? She asked. Halvorsen looked at her with the patience of someone delivering a thing they knew would land hard. The Old Blood Alliance happened to them. 80 years ago. The Alliance, which was, at its founding, a coalition of noble houses who believed the hierarchy of blood determined the right to rule, recognized that a bloodline capable of silencing the wolf in any alpha represented a fundamental threat to everything their power rested on. An alpha without his wolf is an ordinary man. The Stormwalkers could make any lord, any territorial alpha, any dominant pack leader, into an ordinary man, simply by looking at them. She was quiet, the rain against the tower's narrow windows. They were scattered first, Halvorsen continued. Pack bonds broken, properties seized, the line declared disgraced through a series of falsified loyalty charges. Then hunted. Not all of them. It was never advertised as eradication because even then some lords found that distasteful. It was simply a series of unfortunate events, carefully arranged, across one generation. By the time the generation after had grown up, there were no Stormwalker wolves left who knew what they were. Their descendants were collared into service or drove themselves into exile or were absorbed into lower Omega lines with no memory of what they'd carried. The archive was very quiet. My family, Tuva said, your grandmother's grandmother, was the last documented Stormwalker who knew her own name. Halvorsen met her eyes. She was collared at 15. Her children were born to the collar. And the collar, applied young enough and consistently enough, suppresses not just the shift, but the identification markers in the blood that would reveal the lineage. Assessors looking for wolfless find what they expect to find. The gift doesn't manifest in small doses. It requires the wolf, and the wolf had been buried for 3 generations. Tuva looked down at her hands, at the faint marks still visible where the partial emergence had changed them on the night of the attack. The bond activated it, she said. A bond with an alpha of sufficient dominance would create enough of a pull to begin eroding the collar's suppression. Yes. Halvorsen paused. The Alpha King's bond specifically would create considerable pull. Tuva pressed her hands flat on the table. She felt the weight of the information settling through her, layer by layer, the way deep cold worked, not all at once but by degrees, each layer colder than the last. She had been told she was nothing, that she had no wolf, that she was broken, incomplete, a lesser thing that the world had correctly assessed and found wanting. She had been told all of this deliberately, systematically, by people who knew what she was and had decided the knowing should be buried with her. The rage, when it came, was cleaner than she expected. Not hot, not explosive. Something older than that. Something that had been waiting a long time to have a name for itself. Who knows, she said.
Ida.
Now you do. Shortly, the king will. Halvorsen looked at her steadily. Lord Valkoven does not. But he will, once your wolf has fully emerged. The silver markings will be visible at distance. What you did to his hired men, that will reach him through channels. He'll know what it means. He'll know what it means. And he will understand, better than anyone, what a fully emerged Stormwalker bonded to the Alpha King represents for the hierarchy he's spent his life maintaining. The keeper folded her hands. He will not move slowly after that. Tuva nodded. She kept her eyes on the illustration, the silver wolf, the still eyes, the markings that were her inheritance and her identity, and the thing that had been stolen from her before she had any say in the matter. She thought about the collar, about the 7-year-old version of herself, who had never known why it was heavy. She thought about her grandmother's grandmother, collared at 15, who had never known her own name again. She thought about Jonas's expression in the pre-dawn room, the particular quality of it, the way he'd said you're not nothing with the certainty of a man who had just encountered evidence and let it change him. She thought about what it might mean to be allowed to be something, to be allowed to be what she had always been, under all the weight of everything that had tried to bury it. The feeling was too large and too complicated to have a single word. It was rage, and it was grief, and it was something that lived on the other side of both of those things, in the territory she had never been permitted to explore, where wanting things and believing you might someday have them occupied the same space. Thank you, she said to Halvorsen quietly. The keeper nodded once. She was already turning back to her texts. Tuva walked back down the tower's stairs into the keep. The rain had eased. Through the corridor windows, she could see the practice yard, where guards moved through their drills in the gray afternoon light. She needed to tell Jonas. She needed to tell him everything that she had just learned, because it changed the shape of everything, the bond, the politics, the threat, the future. But first she stood in the corridor for one moment, alone, and she let the grief be what it was. 3 generations. 3 generations of deliberately buried wolves, deliberately buried women, deliberately buried names. She was the last of them. She was also the first of them to know. She took a breath. She straightened her spine. She had been making herself small for 23 years, and she would need a little time to learn the shape of the opposite. She started with her shoulders. She let them back, let them take up the space they wanted. Then she went to find the king. Chapter 7. The Price of a Bond. The Emergency Council convened on a Wednesday, 10 days after the conclave, in the Great Chamber where Valdrak's lords had argued their way through 3 successions and 2 civil wars. Valkoven had moved, as Einar had predicted, quickly. The summons to the emergency meeting had gone out within 24 hours of the first assassination attempt's failure, phrased with the careful legal precision of a man who had been planning this possibility for some time. The law of blood purity was 300 years old and had not been invoked in living memory. Its specific provisions were intricate and arcane, and Tuva, who had spent the 3 days before the council sitting in the archive with Halvorsen's junior keeper learning as much as she could about the legal architecture of the society that had kept her collared, understood them now better than most of the lords who were about to invoke them. She stood in the antechamber off the great hall and listened through the door. Jonas had not asked her to leave. He had not forbidden her to listen. He had said, that morning, looking at her with a direct steadiness that was becoming something she recognized as how he showed things that were not comfortable for him to show. They will argue today that I must choose. Kingdom or bond. I need you to hear their arguments, because any decision that affects you should be made with your knowledge. Not to you without it. She had looked at him for a moment. Then she had said, all right. It was not all right. None of it was all right. But she had understood what he was trying to give her, and she had taken it. Valkoven was a precise speaker. She had expected, from his bearing and his politics, something more aggressive, rhetoric designed to inflame, language that appealed to the Lord's worst instincts about blood and status and the ordering of the world. Instead, he was measured. He was almost reasonable if you did not listen too carefully to what the reasonable language was actually arguing. The law granted the collective nobility the right to contest a monarch's mate choice where that choice could be demonstrated to represent a destabilizing risk to the kingdom's succession. The phrasing was careful, legal, airtight. He did not say she is a servant. He did not say she is Omega class, she is nobody, she is below the station of a king. He said, the succession requires certainty, and certainty requires that the mate bond be formed with a recognized noble line whose standing is uncontested and whose capacity to provide stable hereditary succession is documented. He had brought 3 other lords with him, who had already signed their names to the formal petition. He had a 4th in the room who hadn't signed yet, and whose name, if it joined the others, would constitute enough votes to trigger a binding council resolution. Tuva listened to the arguments, and she did not move, and she kept her breathing even. She heard Jonas respond. He had the tone of a man who had been expecting this and had prepared accordingly, which she now knew was the only mode he truly operated in.
He was precise.
He challenged the legal grounds. He challenged the specific provisions Vakovan cited and offered counter-readings that the junior lawyers at the table struggled to immediately refute. But the law was the law, and the law was not, ultimately, on his side. She heard Einar's voice, careful and low. The 4th signature, if given, would require a 30-day period in which the bond must be formally renounced or the resolution proceeds to civil. I know what it requires. Jonas. Cold. There is a path, Vakovan said, and Tuva could hear the satisfaction carefully buried in the professional neutrality of it that avoids the civil procedure. A formal declaration that the bond was an error of incomplete assessment, the servant's wolf status having been misrepresented, the bond having formed under false pretenses, would allow the council to receive it as a mutual dissolution and move forward with.
No.
One word, flat as iron, a silence. Jonas. Einar, lower now. The alternative is. I know what the alternative is. Civil conflict. Vakovan has the West. 3 of the 4 Eastern lords are sympathetic. If the resolution passes and you refuse it, we're looking at. I said I know what it is. Another silence. Tuva pressed her hand against the door, not pushing, just resting there. My king. One of the other lords. She didn't know his voice. We understand the nature of the bond. We understand it is not something chosen. But the kingdom is also not something chosen. The men who would die in a civil war did not choose that either. There must be a calculation that. The antechamber door opened. She had not chosen to open it. Or she had, in the way that decisions are sometimes made in the body before the mind is caught up, the body knowing that there was only one thing that made sense, that the conversation on the other side of the door was about her future, and it was being conducted without her, and that was precisely what she had been told would not happen. She walked into the great chamber. Every head turned. Vakovan's expression, for one fraction of a second, showed something, surprise, then reassessment, then a careful neutrality that she was beginning to recognize as his version of a weapon. Jonas looked at her, something in his face that she couldn't fully read. She stood at the edge of the table, not at the seat of power, not at the king's right hand, just present. I understand, she said, looking at Vakovan, that you're arguing the bond should be dissolved for the stability of the kingdom. Vakovan said nothing. He was watching her the way you watched something you couldn't yet categorize. I have a question, she continued. Her voice was even. Before the vote. A beat of silence. Jonas said nothing. He was very still, watching her with the focused, careful attention that she had come to understand meant he was listening and reserving judgment and trusting her to say the true thing. If the bond is dissolved, she said, and the king takes a political match, Lord Vakovan, you would support Lady Astrid, yes? Vakovan inclined his head slightly. And the lords who signed your petition believe the kingdom's stability requires blood purity in the succession. A recognized noble line. An uncontested standing. She looked around the table. What you're describing is a version of the Stormwalker suppression. You are arguing that a line whose existence threatens the hierarchy your power rests on should be erased again. You are arguing for the continuation of a 300-year-old policy of deliberate burial, because the alternative is a world in which the hierarchy you were born into might not be the permanent, correct order of things. The room was very quiet. I am not nothing, she said. It was the same thing she had said to Jonas in the pre-dawn room, but louder now, and directed outward rather than in. I am the last of the Stormwalker bloodline, and I know from the archive records that your family, she looked at Vakovan directly. Your grandfather's grandfather was on the council that ordered the suppression. The falsified loyalty charges were his work. The collar system, as it applied to Stormwalker descendants, was his invention. The silence had a different quality now. "I am not making an argument," she said. "I am telling you what is true. What you do with it is a council decision. But I will not have my dissolution argued in a room without saying, at least once, what the dissolution is actually for." She stopped. She looked at Jonas. He was looking at her with an expression she had seen once before, in the study, after she'd answered his command with the truth. That specific, undone quality. A man encountering something that changed the shape of what he had thought possible. He stood up. "We are concluded for today," he said. His voice was level, which was doing considerable work. "The council will reconvene in 48 hours. Between now and then, I recommend each lord consider carefully what they are being asked to vote for." He looked at Valkoven. "And what they are being asked to continue." He walked around the table. He crossed to where she stood. He stood beside her. He did not reach for her hand. He did not make a gesture that was, in itself, a political statement. He simply stood beside her in the room where Valdrak's lords argued about her future, and the position of his body said everything that the law and the council proceedings and the political calculations could not. Valkoven's expression was not readable, but the fourth lord, the one who had not yet signed, was looking at Tuva with an expression that was complicated and shifting. Not sympathy, exactly. Something more like the expression of a man reassessing the shape of the thing he had been asked to vote against. He did not sign that day. The vote did not proceed. Not because anyone had changed their minds about the law or the politics or the blood purity arguments that had been made in that chamber for 300 years, but because Tuva Christensen had walked through a door and said her name, her real name, the name of what she was, out loud in a room full of men who had spent their lives depending on her silence. She was beginning to understand that silence had been the cage all along, and she was learning, slowly, painfully, with all the imprecision of a skill acquired late, how to be loud instead.
Chapter 8.
Into the wolf's den. They took her on a Thursday in the gap between the third and fourth watch. It was professional.
She had to give them that.
They had learned from the failure of the first attempt. No hired men this time, no sent from outside anonymity. These were Valkoven's own household wolves, men who had been in his service long enough to be trusted with something that needed to not exist in the official record. They came through the servants' passage in the north wall, which meant someone inside the keep had told them it was there. The guard Jonas had doubled was not, it turned out, doubled in the servants' passage. She woke to a cloth over her nose and mouth that smelled like herbed unconsciousness, and the next thing she knew, she was in a carriage moving north at speed through the dark.
She was not panicking.
She noted this from a slight distance, with the faint curiosity of someone observing their own reactions from outside. She thought she should be panicking, and she wasn't. She was very cold, and her wrists were bound, and the iron collar had been refastened, a different one, heavier, newer, and her head ached with the familiar dull pressure of the suppressor working. She thought about Jonas, about the bond. She could feel it distantly, like a voice heard through water, muffled by the collar and the distance and whatever additional suppression they'd applied. She pressed her awareness toward it. Present. Still there. She held that the way you hold the image of a lamp in a dark room, it is somewhere, which means you can find the direction. She thought about what she knew. She had been taken north. Valkoven's primary territory was north. She gathered from the pre-council intelligence she'd been absorbing over the past 2 weeks, and she had been absorbing it carefully, because information was the only weapon she'd ever had, a fortress at the edge of his northern territory called Ironfell, which was old and defensible and far enough from the capital that things could happen there without immediate witnesses. She thought about what she had in a room with bound wrists and a collar and carriage walls. She had her mind. She had 23 years of learning how to survive in situations where the people with power had decided what her options were, and she had to find the ones they'd missed. She had the partial emergence of a wolf they thought the new collar had fully suppressed. They were wrong about the collar. She could feel it working, could feel the push of a suppression, but it was like trying to hold down a tide with a net now. The wolf had tasted emergence, had broken the surface once, and it was not going back under completely. Not anymore. It pushed at the edges of the collar's reach with the patient, inexorable force of something that knew it was running out of the belief that it couldn't exist. She sat with her back against the carriage wall, and she breathed, and she was patient, because patience was the other thing 23 years had given her, and she waited for the moment when patience became something that could move. The moment came sooner than she expected, not because she'd managed to free her hands or disable the collar or summon help. The moment came because, approximately 8 hours after she'd been taken, the carriage stopped at Ironfell, and Lord Valkoven met her at the gate with the expression of a man who had, he believed, won. He had not brought her here to kill her. Not immediately. She understood this within the first few minutes of the conversation that followed. He had brought her here as leverage, a hostage dressed as a statement. Her presence in his custody and the proof-of-life message he would send to Greyspire were the mechanism by which he intended to force Jonas's hand, surrender the bond, surrender the claim, walk away, and declare the mate selection an error. In exchange, she would be released, returned to servant status, the collar reinstated as a permanent measure.
He was not cruel about it.
That was the unsettling thing. He explained the terms with the calm practicality of a man conducting a difficult but straightforward business transaction. His daughter would be queen. The succession would be secured. The hierarchy would be maintained. The Stormwalker bloodline. He did not flinch from the name, which meant he had confirmed what she was, which meant Halvorson's fear had been correct, would be permitted to persist quietly in a collar, away from influence, away from power, away from the possibility of becoming the thing that threatened everything he'd built his life protecting. She listened to all of this with her wrists still bound and the collar heavy on her throat and her back straight, because there was nothing to be gained from any other posture. "And if the king doesn't accept your terms?" she asked. Valkoven looked at her. "The king will accept my terms. He is a pragmatic man. He has governed this kingdom for 12 years by making the difficult decision when it was necessary. He will make this one." She held his gaze for a moment. "He won't," she said. Something shifted in Valkoven's expression. Not anger. More like a man who has heard an unexpected piece of information and is deciding how to file it. "You sound very certain," he said. "I know him," she said simply. She spent the next 3 days in a room at Ironfell with a window that looked out over the northern forest. The room was not a dungeon. Valkoven was too careful for that. It was a small, functional chamber with a locked door and a guard and enough food that no one could accuse him of mistreatment. She slept and she thought and she worked quietly at the edges of the collar's suppression the way you work at a knot, not with force, but with patience and precision and the specific understanding of where the tension lived. On the third day, she shifted her left hand. Just the left hand. Just the threshold state, the between thing, not fully wolf but not fully human either. She did it quietly, at night, with her back to the door. She held it for 30 seconds and then let it go. She could do it. The new collar was stronger than the old one, but strong enough was not the same as sufficient. Nothing, she was beginning to understand, was sufficient for what she was. It had been suppressed for 3 generations, and it was done being suppressed, and the question was only timing and readiness. On the 4th day, she heard wolves in the outer yard. She moved to the window. Below, in the gray morning, Valkoven's men were assembling. Too many for a patrol, too organized for routine. They were positioning for something. She scanned the northern road. She saw the lone rider before she understood what she was looking at. He had not marched an army. He had not sent an emissary. He had not. She gathered from the evidence of one rider and no visible column behind him, accepted the terms or chosen the kingdom over her or made any of the pragmatic calculations that Valkoven had been so certain would drive his decision. Jonas Farragen had ridden north alone. She pressed her hands against the window glass, and she felt the bond pulse warm through the collar's reach, specific and immediate, and she understood that she had been right about him. That for all his iron and his strategy and his 12 years of ruthlessness, he had ridden north alone in the night to come for her, because there were things that could not be made into strategy without losing what they were. She pulled back from the window. She had 3 days of quiet work on the collar behind her. She had a partially emerged wolf that was not going back under. She had 23 years of learning to find the options that people in power thought they'd removed. She had Valkoven's belief that she was helpless, which was the most useful thing in the room. She began to plan. Chapter 9. Her whisper. Their silence. The courtyard at Ironfell was large enough to hold 40 men comfortably, and Valkoven had filled it with 60. Tuva could see them from the room's window, could see Jonas at the gate, unhelmeted, no visible armor, the lone rider reality of him landing on the assembled men like a statement. He had not come to fight 60 wolves. He had come because there was no arithmetic in the world that would have kept him away. She left the window, sat on the floor, breathed. The collar was a problem, not an insuperable one. She had been working at it for 3 days, and the threshold state was accessible now, inconsistently but meaningfully, but a complication that Vakoven had counted on in his planning. A collared servant was manageable. An uncollared stormwalker was a different conversation. He had put considerable thought into maintaining the former. She thought about what Halvorsen had said. The gift doesn't require violence. It doesn't even require the full shift. It requires the wolf and the gaze. She had the wolf. Partially. Imperfectly. Pressed against the collar's reach with 3 days of patient erosion behind it. She would need more. She pressed her awareness toward the bond. Jonas. He was in the courtyard now. She could feel the shift in the bond's quality, the way it changed when distance narrowed, like a conversation that had been held through walls becoming clearer. She could feel his focus and his anger, and something underneath both of those things that she had no diplomatic word for, something that said you are here, and I am here, and the distance between those two facts is ending. She pushed back. Not in words. The bond didn't carry words, not with the collar still working. But she pushed the quality of I'm ready toward him, the way you lean toward something rather than away from it, and she felt him receive it. She stood. She walked to the door and knocked. The guard opened it, not all the way, but enough. Back away from. Lord Vakoven, she said. Tell him I want to speak to him before he addresses the king. In the courtyard. The guard looked at her with the professional uncertainty of a man who had been given clear instructions and was encountering something outside their scope.
Now, she said.
Please. They brought her down. The courtyard was cold in the gray morning, the kind of cold that carried winter in it even though winter was technically months away, the north's particular preemptive chill that settled into stone and breath and the exposed skin of forearms. 60 wolves arranged around the walls. Vakoven at the center, and Jonas, still at the gate, 10 feet from the first line of men, with the expression of a man who had spent 4 days being extremely angry and extremely controlled about it. He saw her. Something in his face went very still. She saw the shoulder rewrapped, the wound from the first attack, holding. She saw the iron crown and the travel-stained clothes and the singular reality of a king who had ridden through the northern night alone to stand in an enemy's courtyard. She looked at him for 1 moment. Then she looked at Vakoven. He was watching her with the specific, calculating attention of a man who had seen unexpected developments in the past week and was categorizing this as another one. His hand was near his sword. Reflex, not intent. A man who had spent his life measuring threat and had not fully resolved where she sat on that spectrum. The king will agree to the terms, she said. Everything in the courtyard went still, including Jonas. She continued before anyone could move. He'll renounce the bond. Accept Astrid as the political match. Declare the made assessment a formal error of record. She kept her voice even. In exchange, I'm released and permitted to return to the capital. Vakoven looked at her. His expression was measured, precise, the face of a man who is checking for the trap. You're offering to negotiate your own dissolution. I'm offering to speak the terms so we all understand them. Why? Because I want everyone in this courtyard, she said, to be looking at me when I say this. She let the pause rest there. Then she looked at Vakoven, directly, specifically, with the full, unguarded weight of her eyes, and she reached for the wolf. It came. Not perfectly. The collar fought it, pulled at the edges, the suppression asserting itself. But 3 days of patience had made channels through the iron's resistance, and the wolf came up through those channels with the force of something that had been waiting a very long time for exactly this moment. The threshold state, the between thing, her hands and her eyes the primary focus of it, her skin luminous with the silver-gray tint of the Stormwalker lines. She looked at Vakoven and she held the gaze. She did not growl. She did not threaten. She did not make a sound. What she did was look at him, with the full, specific, ancient attention of a bloodline that had been bred for exactly this, refined over generations for exactly this, buried precisely because of this. She looked at him, and she held. His wolf went silent. She watched it happen. She could see it in his body. The micro changes, the shift in his posture from the coiled, managed aggression of an alpha male in his own territory to something different. Not submission. Something quieter than that. Like the moment between sleeping and waking, when the body is present, but the noise hasn't started yet. His wolf, the animal heart of his dominance, the source of everything he had built his power on, fell still. He looked for one moment, before the stillness reached his face, afraid. Not of her, of the silence. Of what it meant to be a man who had built everything he was on the animal beneath him, and to feel it simply stop. The courtyard was very quiet. Around the walls, 60 wolves had stilled. Not through the gift. She didn't have the range or the strength for that, not with the collar on, not yet. But through the primal response of every wolf in the space to the ancient biological fact of a stormwalker in full expression, a deep, instinctive lockup that their bodies performed without consulting their owners. Jonas took 3 steps forward through the frozen courtyard. No one stopped him. He stopped beside her. He looked at Valkoven. The assault on the capital, Jonas said. Quiet, precise. The hired men. The fire in the East Wing. Lord Peterson. The name of the Lord found dead, the one who had spoken in Tuva's defense. I have evidence. It is documented. It has been sent to the High Court Registry with a sealed copy to the 3 neutral territorial lords.
He paused.
What happened here today, in this courtyard, will be added to that record. Valkoven stared at him. He was reassembling himself, the stillness in his wolf already eroding as Tuva released the gaze, the man re-emerging from the shock of his own silence. But he was different now. Something had been opened in him that could not be fully closed again. Something had been shown. You cannot silence every wolf in Valdrak, he said to her. His voice was controlled. Barely. No, she agreed. I can't. She looked at him steadily. But every Alpha Lord in Valdrak who was in that emergency council chamber 2 weeks ago knows what I said about your grandfather. And every lord who is standing in this courtyard now knows what I just did. And every man here will have to decide, when they consider which side of history to stand on, whether the side that needs a 300-year-old suppression maintained is the side they want to stay on. Another silence. Valkoven's jaw was tight. He was calculating. She could see it, the rapid machinery of a man who had spent decades turning situations to his advantage, looking for the lever, looking for the angle. There was no angle. The evidence was already filed. The witnesses were already present. The moment had been witnessed by 60 men in a courtyard, and 60 wolves knew what they had felt their bodies do, and that was not a thing that could be undocumented or reframed. He had planned his rebellion on the assumption that she would be powerless. She had stopped being powerless in a pre-dawn room 8 days ago, when she had said I didn't before, I think I do now, and discovered, slowly, that the truth was louder than anything she had ever been taught. Valkoven looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked away. It was not defeat. It was not surrender. It was the specific, ungraceful capitulation of a man who still had resources and would use them and was already calculating the slower, longer game that did not involve open battle in a northern courtyard. But it was also the only thing that mattered in this moment. He looked away. Jonas's hand found her wrist. Not her hand, her wrist, where the binding had left marks, gentle and specific, the touch of a man who was making a very small, very definite statement about whose presence he was claiming. We're leaving, he said. She walked out of Ironfell beside the Alpha King of Valdrak, through 60 still wolves and under a gray northern sky, with a collar still on her throat and a wolf still pressing at its edges and more unfinished things ahead of her than she could count. But she walked. Not shuffled, not disappeared. Walked, with her shoulders back and her head level, and the silver of her bloodline still faint and fading on her hands. Behind her, the courtyard was quiet for a very long time. Chapter 10. What she chose. The collar came off on a Sunday. Not in ceremony. Not in the grand hall with lords assembled and political statements rendered. It came off in Jonas's private study, with a locksmith who had been brought in at dawn and who asked no questions, and Einar standing at the door with the expression of a man witnessing something he would not be able to adequately explain to future historians. The locksmith worked for 11 minutes. The iron released with a sound that was smaller than Tuva had expected, a soft, definitive click, and then the weight was gone from her throat. She had carried it for 16 years. 23 really, but the ones she could remember were 16. She sat very still for a moment after it was removed, her hand at her throat where the skin was marked and raw, and finally, for the first time in her conscious memory, just skin, exposed to air, belonging entirely to itself. She did not cry. She thought she might, and she didn't. What she felt was larger and quieter than crying, something that needed more room than a response, that needed time and space and the patience to process itself. Later, she thought. There will be time for it later. The days that followed Ironfell were the most complicated days she had ever lived through, and that was saying something given the trajectory of the past 3 weeks. Vakovan was contained but not destroyed. He had left Ironfell and retreated to his primary territory with the careful movements of a man calculating his next long game. The evidence that Jonas had filed was being reviewed by the High Court, a process that would take months and produce, at best, a formal censure and a penalty that a man of Vakovan's resources could absorb. The Emergency Lords' Council reconvened. The fourth lord who had not signed Vakovan's petition had, in the week since the courtyard, become the first lord to publicly declare support for the king's bond claim. He was not young and he was not idealistic, and his support was not, Tuva suspected, primarily motivated by feeling. It was motivated by the calculation of a man who had been in that courtyard and had felt his wolf go still and had understood, in the aftermath, which way the wind was blowing. Politics did not become simple. The law of blood purity was formally challenged before the High Court. The collar system, not just for Stormwalker descendants but for all Omega-class servants, was raised as a contested legal matter by a coalition of lower house lords who had been waiting for an opening. Reform, Einar told her during one of the briefings she had begun attending as a matter of course, was not a single moment. It was a direction. She understood directions. She had been finding them in tight spaces for 23 years. The wolf came fully in the 3rd week. Not during a crisis. She had expected it to come in the heat of something, in the pressure of danger or need. Instead, it came on a quiet Tuesday morning in the courtyard, when she was alone, and the air was cold, and she simply allowed it. Stopped suppressing what had never actually needed suppressing. Let it rise without the collar's weight, without the years of habit, without the practice shrinking. It was silver gray, larger than an ordinary wolf, with the flank markings that she recognized from Halvorson's illustration. She stood in the courtyard in wolf form for the first time, and the sensation was nothing like what she'd expected from 23 years of thinking about something she'd been told she'd never have. It was not dramatic. It was not overwhelming. It was simply right, like the breath after being held underwater, like the particular, unremarkable rightness of being the thing you had always been. She shifted back, stood in the cold courtyard, breathed. Then she went inside and asked Jonas to show her the treaty table, because there was a border negotiation with the Northern Territories that needed preparation, and she had thoughts about the framing. The conversation about what came next happened on a Friday evening 2 weeks after Ironfell, in the study with the fire and the maps. It was not a formal conversation. It began as most important conversations began between them, obliquely, approaching the center from an angle. Einar wants to formalize the bond claim, Jonas said. He was standing at the map table, looking at the Northern Territory outline, publicly. A formal declaration before the court. I know, she said. He mentioned it. It would change the political landscape significantly. Not cleanly. There are lords who won't accept it for years. There are legal challenges still in process. The succession question will. Jonas. He stopped. She was sitting in the chair by the fire, and she looked at him across the room with the steady dark eyes that he had, she knew, been thinking about since the night of the conclave, possibly before, though neither of them had been able to acknowledge that yet. She looked at him without the layer of careful management that she had spent years applying to the way she faced the world. Ask me, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he set down the map he'd been holding. He crossed the room. He stood in front of her and he looked at her, and he did not look like the Iron King, not right now, not in the firelight with the maps behind him and the late evening quiet. He looked like a man who had ridden north alone in the dark because there was no arithmetic that could have kept him away, and who had spent 34 years building a life out of control and certainty, and was standing at the edge of both of those things, and deciding not to step back. "Stay," he said. "Not I want you to stay, not the political argument for why staying was strategically optimal, not the carefully framed case he was certainly capable of building. Just stay." She looked at him. She thought about the girl she had been at 7 when the collar first went on. She thought about the 16 years of carefully cultivated invisibility. She thought about the moment in the corridor when she had looked at Halvorson's illustration and understood what had been taken from her and felt the first clean edge of rage. She thought about the pre-dawn room, and I think I do now, and the way Jonas had stood beside her in the council chamber, without reaching for her hand, just positioned himself as a fact. She thought about wanting things. She had spent 23 years not wanting things because wanting things was a form of exposure, and exposure led to being seen, and being seen led to being targeted, and targeted led to everything that her life had already been. She had survived by not wanting. She was so tired of surviving. "I'm not staying because I have to," she said. Her voice was quiet and even and completely steady in a way that had nothing to do with suppression and everything to do with the fact that she meant it. "I'm staying because I finally want something. And I'm not afraid of it anymore." Something moved across Jonas Faragin's face. Not the fractional softening she had learned to read, not the controlled micro-expression of a man managing his responses. Something larger than that. Something that had been held very tightly for a very long time, releasing with the particular force of things that have been held too long. He breathed out. A single, long breath. Like a man who had been braced for a blow that didn't come. Like a man who had, for 34 years, been very good at armor and had just discovered, with profound and bewildering relief, that he did not need it here. The collar, the old one, the one he had taken from the locksmith, the one that represented 16 years of iron weight on her throat, was on the table between them. He picked it up, looked at it for a moment with the expression of a man holding something he intended to never put down again. Then he set it back down with a deliberateness that was its own declaration. "Then stay," he said. She stayed. In the weeks that followed, the formal declaration was made before the court. Einar managed the political fallout with the efficiency of a man who had been preparing for exactly this and had several contingency strategies already assembled. The High Court began its review of the collar laws. The Stormwalker bloodline was entered into the official record of Valdrax nobility, not as a relic or a historical footnote, but as a living, present, uncontested line. Tuve attended her first formal council as Jonas's bonded mate on a Tuesday morning in the Great Hall of Greyspire Keep, in a chair beside the throne rather than moving along the wall with the platters. She sat in it with the careful uprightness of someone who is learning a new way to take up space, the way you learn anything real, imperfectly and deliberately, and with full attention to each step. Afterward, standing at the window of the south wing room that had become hers in the weeks of upheaval, looking out over the practice yard, she let herself feel the full weight of it. The length and the cost and the distance traveled. The collars and the cold floors and the 23 years of being told what she was worth. The grandmother's grandmother who had died in iron and never held again. She held now, not metaphorically. She shifted, in the private courtyard behind the south wing where she had first shifted alone on that quiet Tuesday, and she raised her head to the gray Valdrax sky, and she howled with the full voice of the Stormwalker bloodline, silver gray and ancient and finally free. In the keep behind her, she felt the bond pulse warm and specific. Felt Jonas, 2 floors up, go still the way he went still when something reached him through the bond that he wanted to hold on to. In the city beyond the walls, she heard it, faintly, then more fully, then in a wave that moved from the nearest houses outward and outward across the valley, the answering howl of Valdrax wolves. Not submission, not hierarchy, something else, recognition. The sound that a pack makes when it hears something it has been waiting for without knowing what it was waiting for. Something that was lost has been found. Something that was buried has come home. Tuva Christensen, last of the Stormwalkers, mate of the Alpha King, the woman who had survived 23 years of being told she was nothing by deciding, in the end, to be everything, howled back at the moon. And the moon, which had seen the whole of it, heard her.
If you enjoy watching this story, please like and subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.